Okay, the meeting is now live, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much, Vicky. And we've certainly got enough people with quorum so we can commence. Can I begin first of all by apologising? I said to some members and officers earlier, my camera for some reason is showing as no available camera. When I click on it, no camera to link to. So I've no idea because there is a camera on this computer and I was using it earlier. So I'm going to have to go basically blind. I can see all of you, but sorry that I can't come up as a picture. I'm not concealing a huge weight gain, as I mentioned earlier. Okay, so we best formally start the meeting. As usual, I've got some preamble to go through, so I'll do the necessaries first of all. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Councillor Jason Zackley, Chair of the Scrutiny Management Panel. Welcome to this virtual meeting that is being broadcast to enable the press and public to view it. We are meeting virtually in response to the limitations placed on governance by the COVID-19 pandemic. The City Solicitors advise that in accordance with Section 78 of the Coronavirus Act 2020, this meeting will be run by reference to the model standing orders as set out in the local authorities, open brackets, coronavirus, closed brackets, flexibility of local authority meetings, regulation 2020 number 392. Okay, I'll give you time just to finish writing that down. Please can members and officers turn their microphones off when not speaking to avoid potential feedback. I now call on those members of the panel that are actually here to introduce themselves, beginning with Councillor Leo Madden.
Councillor Leo Madden, Nelson Ward, present.
Can I ask Councillor Simon Bosher?
Councillor Simon Bosher, Drayton and Farlington, present, Chair.
Okay. Councillor Fielding, are you present? Nope. Councillor Joe Hooper.
Good afternoon, Chair. Councillor Joe Hooper present here, Paulsgrove Ward.
Okay, next my old buddy, Councillor Peter Harris.
Councillor Scott Peter Harris, Hillsey Ward present.
Okay. Councillor Will Purvis.
Councillor Will Purvis from Milton Ward present.
Thank you, Will. Councillor Linda Symes. Are you present? Nope. Okay, and finally, Councillor Tom Wood, who's deputising for Councillor Dowling. Councillor Tom Wood, are you here? Nope. Okay. Right, well, those of us that are here identified themselves. Everybody else comes in later on, then obviously I'll get them to join. The agenda today basically is going to be a Chris Ward Roadshow, so it'll give Chris will be giving basically a presentation on the budget, and at the end of which we can ask any questions or comments that we choose to make. To formally begin the agenda, the first item is apologies for absence. I've been notified of one apology, which is Councillor Ben Dowling. He's unable to attend because of our prior commitments, and Councillor Tom Wood was due to be deputising for him. Item 2, declarations of interest.
My apologies in advance. I'll have to drop off at 2:30 if we're not done by then, as I have another work meeting I can't get out of.
Okay, all right, thank you, Will.
Chair, could I add, I've got a funeral at 2 o'clock.
Okay, anybody going for 1:30? Right, okay, well, I'll bear in mind both of those two commitments that you've both got. Hopefully we won't go too long, but thank you for letting me know. Item 2 is declarations of interest. Does any member have a declaration of interest, please? Speak up if you have. Nope. Okay, item 3, minutes of the meeting held on the 9th of November 2020. And are members happy with these as a correct record? Are you happy?
Agreed.
Sorry. Okay, thank you. They're agreed, no dissent. And finally, the last item on the agenda, which is the presentation on Portsmouth City Council budget and the council tax for 2021-22 and the medium-term forecast 22-23 to 24-25. Chris Ward will provide an overview concentrating on the executive summary. Can I ask you members, if you've got questions, try and save them to the end unless you feel it's dire emergency to butt in and ask it. Wait for Chris to do his presentation and I'll take comments and questions at the end. Chris, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. If I can start with an apology as well. First, that the papers were probably just over a day late, so I apologise for that, and I apologise to Councillor Scott Pater Harris, who was really keen to see me do a PowerPoint presentation today, I'll do my best to compensate. I'll take you through the executive summary, but I'll flesh that out as we go, if that's okay with committee members.
Apology accepted.
Thank you, Scott. Very gracious. Or Councillor Peter Harris, sorry. Okay, I'll use my screen to share, and I'll just take you through step by step of the exec summary. And as I said, I'll take you, I'll flesh it out as I go along. I think one thing that I'd like to start with is that this is actually quite a complicated budget this year, and that's largely because of the way a number of items have been treated, and particularly how we've been funded by governments for some of the implications associated with the COVID pandemic. So just by way of example, there's lots of business rate reliefs that have been awarded this year. Many of you will know they relate to the expanded retail relief scheme, as well as the nursery relief scheme. Now, the way the government have handled this is that they've given councils full compensation for those, but they've given the full compensation in the current year, so in 2020, 2021, but the costs don't hit the council until 21-22. So there are some complications associated with how the budget is presented, but they're broadly budget neutral. I think that's the important thing. They are fully funded. It's just that we're receiving funding in this year, but the cost side of it will be incurred by the council next year. And just to complicate matters even further, there is a degree of compensation also that government have provided to local authorities in relation to any council tax deficits that councils will incur as a direct consequence of COVID, as well as any business rates retained deficits that councils will incur, again, as a direct consequence of COVID. Now, again, whilst that relief has been, or recompense has been provided for in the current year, the costs of those are not actually incurred by the council until the next 3 years, because they've allowed local authorities to spread those deficits over future years. So again, we've got costs, if you like, in future years, but we've got funding in the current year. So they're just some complications associated with the budget this year. And whilst some of the, if you do look at, particularly if you look at Appendix A, which sets out all of the numerical side of the budget, you will see that it's quite difficult to make comparisons year by year, because we do have this mismatch between funding and costs. So that's kept us exercised over the last few weeks in pulling this together, but I'll try to decipher that as we go through. Chair, I'm in your hands really. I can see that members might want to raise their hand. If it helps, I'm quite happy to stop after each section and then take questions as a suggestion, or we can do as you suggested at the outset, which was to take questions at the very end.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Probably on reflection, it may well be easier to take them after each particular section rather than save up a huge chunk to the end, keeps it fresh in people's minds. So, yeah, we'll take that pattern to it. My hand up so far, I'll choose Councillor Peter Harris. So when you feel you've finished this particular section, Chris, then I'll take questions then.
Okay, thanks, Chair. Okay, so the first part really is just looking back in history and the context of the council's financial position. So you'll be aware, because we've lived through a period of austerity and what that means for local government funding. Obviously, that has been of a much lesser impact, certainly in the last couple of years. But if we do look over the past 10-year period, then the council's actually made significant savings over that period of 103 million, which in proportionate terms is about nearly half of all of the council's controllable spending that the council had way back in 2010-11. Again, also contextual, but it's important to note that well over 50% of the council's controllable spending is on those essential care services of adult social care and children's social care. So if the council ever has a financial problem, then it's very difficult for the large spending areas not to be part of any remedy or any plans going forward to remedy that. And obviously the council has been pursuing across all administrations, a budget strategy that seeks to minimise any reductions in services, and obviously therefore seeks to maximise any savings through either income generation, creativity, or efficiency savings. I will carry on into the next section and then pause. That was just background. I think the other thing that is scene setting really is that every year the council goes through a budget consultation exercise. This year has obviously been different because that consultation exercise hasn't been an in-person exercise. But nevertheless, it has been quite substantial, and there were a good number of consultees that responded. So well over 1,500 consultees responded to the consultation, and the key messages that come out of that consultation were that in relation to council tax, 79% supported some form of council tax increase. So that could be either 1%, 2%, 3%, so forth, but 79% supported some form of council tax increase, as opposed to the alternative, which would have been to reduce council services. When asked the question about the what's called the adult social care precept, so the additional council tax that government have allowed councils to put on the tax bill specifically to fund adult social care services, then 2/3 of respondents said that they would support an additional 3% council tax, so that money could go to support adult social care services. And then when asked about their top priorities, the top priorities come in two flavours. So the question was asked first in terms of our day-to-day revenue spending, so general spending that we make, for example, around waste collection and so forth. And the responses were that their number one priority was collecting rubbish and recycling. Second priority was essentially adult social care. And the third priority was children's social care. When residents were asked, and in terms of capital investment, so investing in your city into major facilities or major infrastructure, the response from consultees was that they would like to see that on number one priority, they'd like to see making rubbish and recycling collections more environmentally friendly. Secondly, that they would like to see improved facilities for walking, cycling, sustainable travel, obviously environmental considerations there. And thirdly, they would like to see urgent repairs to school buildings addressed. So hopefully, if you've had the opportunity to read the budget report, you will see a lot of those themes coming out in the recommendations of the budget report that will be before both Cabinet on next Tuesday for endorsement and for Council the following Tuesday on the 9th for approval. And thank you, Chair. I'll stop there for questions if there are any.
Okay, thank you, Chris. There is one councillor indicated who wishes to speak, but before we go to that, I notice Councillor Tom Wood has arrived. Councillor Wood, have you got any interest that you feel you need to declare?
Sorry about that, muted. No, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Okay, the only question, well, the only person that's nominated to speak is Councillor Scott Pater-Harris. So, Scott, your question, please, or your comment?
No, thank you, Chair. It's just to note that, Chris, when you started off talking about the council tax support, and I noted that the government gave an extra £670 million across the country to councils on top of the financial settlement. So just wondering how much of that government money did Portsmouth receive, and overall, looking at the budget report, it seems that government money has balanced the budget significantly. Would you agree with that?
I think as we go through the presentation, the next two parts of the presentation, one will be the current year's budget, where we can alight on some of those issues. But certainly when we get to the next year's budget, some of those issues will come out in terms of the extent of funding for the council by central government. So perhaps once I've done that part of the presentation, if you have any questions on that, then I can pick them up at that stage.
Yes, no problem.
Thanks.
Okay, Chris, there are no further members indicate they wish to speak, so if you want to go on to your next segment, thank you.
Okay, so the first part of this is obviously the budget report is in chronological order. So the first part of the budget report deals with the current year's budget and whether there are any necessary changes to the current year's budget. This is obviously this is related to the complications that I mentioned earlier on, where obviously at the start of the financial year we didn't have any indication of what the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic would be, how that would impact not just on businesses and how government have responded to that through councils, but also how it would impact on residents as well, and what that also might mean for council costs. So in overall terms, the council during the current year, and our estimates actually for the rest of the year, are that costs directly associated with the COVID-19 pandemic will total 33.1 million. Now, 33.1 million excludes the business reliefs that have been provided as well, which I'll touch on separately. So it's obviously it's a substantial amount of money, and a substantial amount of money that wasn't included in the budget when we did this exercise this time last year. So obviously the revised budget needs to accommodate that. We have done all of our estimates of what we think how that 33.1 million is made up. And again, just by way of background, that really breaks down into three component parts. The first component being actual genuine additional costs. So for example, that might be, or a lot of that will be the amount of PPE that has been bought by the council and then provided out to care settings. It will be the support to external care providers that the council has provided. It's the costs associated with the hotel accommodation for off sleepers. It's a whole range of things which add up to 10.6 million pounds in total. In addition to that, and actually a greater financial impact on the council over and above the cost, is the losses of income. So that you'll be aware that the council's budget actually relies on a great deal of income in order to support council spending. So our forecast losses of income within that 33.1 million amount to 17.5 million pounds. And large elements of that are income lost at the commercial ferry port, because obviously we don't have any passengers coming over the quay. Large elements are parking income that has been lost as a consequence of basically, well, firstly, that there was no parking enforcement in the first part of the pandemic, and latterly, obviously, there's been lots of retail closed, so parking income is significantly down. Losses of income, museums. Also, the income that we would have received ordinarily from, for example, concessions around leisure centres. Can I just check? Everything's just gone quiet. If you can still hear me?
Yes, we can.
You can. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. So losses of income has been a big feature of the impact of the COVID pandemic on the council this year. And then on top of that, we anticipate £1.1 million loss of council tax income as a direct consequence of the pandemic, and about just under £4 million loss of business rates as a consequence of the pandemic as well. You bring all of that together, it's an overall cost to the council of 33.1 million. Obviously, the government have provided significant recompense for all of that, and the recompense amounts to 31.9 million. So in overall terms, the net cost to the council of the pandemic is about 1.2 million pounds. So that's the extent to which we estimate our cost, losses of income and losses of funding would not be recompensed overall. You will also know that earlier in the year, and we obviously a report went to Cabinet and went on to Council, where the Council was forecasting quite a significant potential net cost of the COVID pandemic, i.e. government funding has come out in 4 major tranches during the year, and obviously at different points, and therefore at different points during the year, we were unaware the extent of which central government would fund local government for the pandemic. So we've had varying forecasts of what that impact might be, but being a responsible council, we had to plan on the basis that we may not get some of that recompense because it hadn't been announced. So the council, in my view, obviously wisely set aside £11.9 million that it found from a number of sources, which it retained in the event that we may not have got all of the funding that we do now know to be received by government, but secondly, we were planning on both a central based scenario and a pessimistic scenario. So within the papers that you are seeing is still remains our central assumption. There is still opportunity for that central assumption to become more pessimistic. But in any event, what has been sought to have been achieved in the budget is the original £11.9 million that was set aside as the deficit recovery strategy, i.e. impact of COVID, sought to keep that intact plus a bit more and set it aside. So that's been set aside, remains set aside in the budget at the moment to be carried forward into next financial year. It is our realistic expectation that dealing with the COVID emergency itself will obviously continue, particularly as we've got lockdown periods, but there will be a legacy associated with COVID as well, which I'm sure you'll recognise that beyond COVID, there will be a recovery. We could see rising numbers, rising unemployment, which has a natural consequence of reduced business rates income, but also reduced income, council tax income as well, in particular, because there will be more people that will be eligible for local council tax support. And on top of that, we still expect income losses to carry on throughout for a while, and they will recover over time. And we expect that some of the additional costs that adults and children's social care have experienced will also continue for some period over the next 3 years. So there's protection for the council moving into next financial year associated with the legacy impact of COVID. And the final point to make, I think, on the revised budget is that in overall terms, there's a forecast underspend of £2.9 million. Now that's for non-COVID related items, because the revised budget makes full coverage for that impact of COVID that I've just previously explained. The non-COVID element of the budget we're forecasting will be a £2.9 million underspend, and as you see as I'll go forward later on, that is also being used to support next year's budget, so the budget for 2021-22. And I will pause there for any questions, Chair.
So far, none was indicated. Members, opportunity now. I'll let Chris move on. Right, no one's indicated, so Chris, carry on.
Thank you, Chair. So the budget for next year then, so you'll recall that when the budget was approved this time last year, there was a forecast deficit over the following 3-year period of forecast at £3 million. On the basis of a £3 million forecast deficit, the resolution of council was that savings requirements be set for the following 3 years, with this year's saving being a firm resolution and the following 2 years' savings being indicative, because the forecast is obviously refreshed on a rolling base, on a 3-year rolling basis. So the resolution last year was that a savings requirement of £1 million for this financial year be set. The budget proposals actually include savings of £1.3 million for, and the reason why that's in excess of the 1 million is because the administration are proposing that in the budget that's put before you, that they mainstream the funding for the current 2 rounds of food waste recycling collection. Prior to now, that has been funded by the Cabinet Reserve or the Portfolio Reserve, and they're not ongoing sources of funding. So it could never have been funded from there on a permanent basis. It was funded from there initially as a pilot scheme, but the administration are now proposing that that gets embedded in full into budgets going forward. Separate to the budget recommendations, there will be another report to Cabinet next week. I think it's entitled Extension of Food Waste Collection. And within that report, there will be proposals to extend the food waste collection service from the 2 rounds that are embedded as proposals in this report by a further 2 rounds. And again, that's funded from the Cabinet Reserve. And on the basis that that is approved, then there will be a food waste recycling service that covers 2/3 of the city. They will also seek to it also says in that report, they seek to identify savings in the future to also embed that second phase of two rounds. So to embed the 2/3 coverage across the city. So that deals with the requirement to the requirement on the administration by council to achieve the savings requirements. If I turn to the local government finance settlement, so it's still provisional actually. So the provisional settlement was announced in the week just prior to Christmas, and it has provided a substantial amount of funding for the impact of COVID going forward. But in the government's words, I think when the settlement was announced, they said it will give councils funding security for until halfway through the year, or the first 6 months of the year. When they said the first 6 months of the year, they meant the calendar year. So it gives councils funding security in government terms for the first quarter of the financial year. And the funding that they've provided is they've provided another tranche of what they call their emergency funding. So as I mentioned earlier, in last financial year, we had 4 tranches of that. So they've provided another tranche into next year amounting to 6.6 million. And if we wanted to contextualize that in terms of how does that compare with the funding that was provided the whole year this year, then the funding for the whole year this year is 19.4, so 6.6. The other thing that government have announced as part of the provisional settlement is that they'll continue to provide a scheme that is currently in force, which is called the Sales Fees and Charges Compensation Scheme. And what that does is it gives you recompense for all of your, not all, but the majority of your income losses. It doesn't include commercial property, but it does include things like recompense for example, reduction in income from the port, parking, and some of those other examples I gave earlier on, such as museums. But it doesn't fully fund it. It only funds it at 70%, roughly 70% of your loss. Other key things emerging out of the provisional settlement is that there's an additional £1.4 million provided to fund pressures in both adults and children's social care. And then on top of that, and I think this relates to the question that Councillor Pater Harris raised earlier on. There's additional funding of £1.7 million for local council tax support. So what happens in essence is the council's council tax income will be reduced because there'll be more local council tax support applications, i.e. and therefore less council tax income coming in. But the government have provided a grant in compensation of about £1.7 million. So that's intended to provide funding for the expected increased caseload and applications for local council tax support. In addition to that, you will have heard that the government have allowed councils the flexibility to increase council tax by that additional 3% called the adult social care precept. So that's obviously part of the proposals for the coming year, but it has enabled, and I'll repeat this in a second, that raises about £2.5 million. But it has enabled the council to provide additional funding to adult social care in the sum of £2.8 million, so over and above the level that is provided in the precept. And that's to cover a number of things. Obviously, it's the pressures that the adult social care are currently experiencing, and also to cover the national living wage increase. So the national living wage increase is obviously very important for our care providers. They employ quite a lot of people that are subject to the national living wage, and that's passed on to councils through the provider fees. Other proposals within the budget for next year are to replenish the medium-term resource strategy reserve. So that's the spend to save reserve that the council holds. You might recall that as part of the current year's deficit recovery strategy, there was a withdrawal of £5 million from that reserve in order to be able to accommodate any potential impact of COVID-19. That left the reserve at quite a very, very low level and not really appropriate to be able to be a proper vehicle to support the council in delivering its savings going forward. So the addition of the £3 million will raise the level of that reserve to an uncommitted level of 4.8 million. And obviously that's a reserve that's supposed to support the council over support council spend to save and invest to save initiatives over the medium term. Some of you may recall that when the budget was prepared last year, just by way of context, almost £6 million was drawn out of the MTRS reserve to fund spend to save schemes. So having a reserve with an uncommitted balance of 4.8 million really is quite modest in comparison to the council's recent history. I alluded to it earlier on. Obviously, there's proposals in the report to increase the council tax by just under 5% in total terms. 1.99% is for general council services, and 3%, as I've mentioned, for the adult social care precept. Probably worth recognising that every 1% of council tax raised is £820,000. So 1.99% for inflation, basically for council services, would raise about 1.6 million. The council's actual inflation next year is about 2.4 million. So there is a shortfall between the increase in council tax for services in general and the level of inflation that the council will experience. Now, ordinarily, we would, in a normal year, we wouldn't expect big fluctuations, for example, in local council tax support. So whilst raising the council tax in itself will raise 2.5 million for adult social care and 1.6 in general, the council will actually suffer a reduction in council tax income of £1.9 million due to the uplift in, the increased likely take up of local council tax support. But as you heard me say earlier on, there is a grant available from government of £1.7 million. So it's broadly neutral. And coming towards the end now, one of the major proposals within the budget for next year is a revenue contribution to capital of £4.2 million. So there's capital investment proposals within this report that amount to over £35 million and some significant new schemes in there as well. But in order to be able to fund that level of capital investment, it required a contribution from the revenue budget of £4.2 million. And finally, there is a withdrawal from general reserves in the year. So in effect, what that means is that the council's spending level is £2 million more than its overall funding level, and it requires to be balanced from a withdrawal from general reserves. But you will note what I said earlier in the presentation, which was in the previous or in the revised budget or the current year, there is a forecast underspend of £2.9 million. That in effect is supporting this year's budget. So in overall terms, across the 2 years, general reserves have not been reduced. I'll pause there for a second.
Thank you, Chris. Again, I've got no members indicating they wish to speak or raise a question at this point, so carry on again. Thank you. That was a cue for you, Chris.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. The next part of the presentation now is the forward look. So it's beyond next financial year. So we've been through all of the key features of the budget for 21-22, and now this is a forward look into 22-23 and those 3 years. Excuse me. And so we've been through an exercise where we've revised every single assumption that is factored into our forecasts, because we have this 3-year rolling forecast. So we've made our best estimates of what we think the 3-year impact of COVID will be. We've made our best estimates about what we think is going to happen to inflation, our best estimates around what we think will happen to business rates, council tax, government funding, comprehensive spending review, the overhaul of the local government funding system that's coming up, and many, many other factors as well, budget pressures across adults, children, social care, and so forth. We've pulled all of that together, and our central expectation is that we believe that we will also have a £3 million deficit for the next 3-year period. So the indication really is that in general terms, our spending levels as we are now in the steady state are probably about £1 million more than our funding level. So that would require the council, if it were to maintain an even savings profile over that period, to make a saving of £1 million for 22-23, a further £1 million in 23-24, and a further £1 million in 24-25. On that basis, if the council did proceed along that basis, which clearly would be my recommendation, then the council's general reserves would remain at their historic levels of around about £19-20 million. And I can't emphasize enough at the moment, and in the current climate, how absolutely crucial it is to keep a good, resilient level of general reserves. I have said within the report that that forecast could be, because of all of the uncertainty that I've just described around business rates, council tax, the overhaul of the local government funding system, the comprehensive spending review, and so forth, that the forecast could be out by plus or minus £3 million, which again would potentially change those future years savings requirements, either, for example, at the extremes, up to £2 million each and every year, or down to zero. We will know much more once we see the outcome of the comprehensive spending review and the overhaul of the local government funding system, which we expect to take place during next year. Pause at that point, Chair.
Okay, again, members, any questions? No. Okay, sorry, you're not getting much of a break here, Chris, so carry on.
Okay, thank you. So the penultimate part of the presentation really is the capital programme. And again, I've got one apology here because there is a mistype in one of the figures, which I'll talk to you about as we go through. But as I said a few minutes ago, the overall proposed new capital investment is £35.8 million. Now that's not all council funding. It does, there is a good degree of external funding built within that, but it requires the council funding in order to lever in the external funding itself. So overall capital investment, £35.8 million, and you can see the key investments in front of you, those that are of significant scale. And I think you'll probably recognise some of the themes within that proposed list of investments that have come through the budget consultation. So I'll mention just a couple of things. Obviously, the one that stands out at the top is a new leisure centre, pool and community centre, and that's obviously a significant new investment for some older facilities that currently exist. School buildings, £9.5 million. That really covers two separate things. It relates to a scheme for new school places for children with special educational needs. That's a scheme of just about £7.9 million. And it also includes £1.5 million or £1.6 million for the urgent condition repairs to school buildings. Football facilities at King George V, there's additional money put into that. The total scheme cost is £3.2 million, but there's additional funding for that in the new capital programme, and that again is intended to lever in funding from the Football Foundation. Potential borrowing capacity for what's called future high street regeneration to match some of the funding that the council has been successful in receiving in the current year for high streets. There's a fair amount of funding again for IT infrastructure, and that's across the board really. So that's much of that relates to education IT. Some of it relates to legal IT systems. Some of it relates to CCTV, for example, as well, where the either our software or infrastructure is coming towards end of life. Cosham redevelopment, that actually relates to the acquisition of the police and fire stations in Cosham, but it's phase one, effectively, of a land assembly exercise, whilst a wider development scheme is being drawn up. £1 million for traffic and transportation, so for transport measures, and a number of environmental enhancements in there, not least the capital requirement for the food waste recycling scheme at 340 million, because as a consequence of rolling out the food waste recycling scheme for an extra 2 rounds, there are requirements for another couple of refuse vehicles and bins and other associated costs as well. So in overall terms, I think if you look at the overall position, I think you can see that there's good coverage. There's good coverage within the budget, particularly not just the coming year's budget, and future years' budget for the impact of COVID and its legacy. The overall position in terms of the forecast deficit is relatively modest at £3 million, and the council's general reserves remain in a reasonably robust position, given the council confidence that it has got a robust and resilient financial position. And that's the end of my presentation, Chair.
Chris, thank you very much. A very comprehensive outline to us. I have one member who's actually indicated to speak, Councillor Joe Hooper.
Hi, Chris. Can I just ask, please? You just mentioned the acquisition of the old police station in Cosham. Why have the council acquired it, and what will its new function be? Do you have that information yet?
I don't have all of it, but there's it's part of an early. There's some early work being undertaken for a redevelopment that would include it would include additional affordable. It's seeking to include additional affordable housing. I think some community facilities and some shared health facilities as well. I think the intention is that the fire service will move across to the old PCMI site, and there may also be some police provision within there as well. Not a station in itself, but a police presence there. I think that's probably as much as my knowledge takes me on that one. I hope that's okay.
Okay, thank you, Joe. Anybody else? Okay, no, there is nobody else. So there was no formal decision for us to make today as a panel anyway. It was simply to hear the outline of the budget as Chris had just presented. We could have, if we chose to do so, make some considerations for Cabinet, but there's been nothing that's come forward from this meeting. So unless anyone else has any other points they'd like to make or say, I declare the meeting closed. Anyone? Okay, well that's it. Thank you very much for your attendance. Meeting is formally over and this will proceed on to Cabinet next week. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I'll just turn off my live stream.
Thank you.